What is the difference between talking and having a conversation? I'm Andrew, I'm the flannel philosopher. I know I'm not wearing flannel today because I am at the Blue Ridge Parkway and I am on my way back home, but I thought I'd record a quick video and examine the difference between talking and having a conversation. I think a lot of times we assume those two are the same exact thing because we know how to talk, therefore we know how to communicate. Most of us learn to talk at 1 or 2 or 3, or some of you really speedy learners, maybe 5 years old, and as a result, there's an assumption that you know how to communicate as well. And yet, nothing could be further from the truth. We learn to talk in about a couple of years, and we spend the rest of our lifetime learning how to communicate. Well, what's the difference between talking and communicating then? Aren't they part of it? Well, for one, not all communication is vocal. They actually say nonverbal communication is a huge percentage of communication. I think that's why face-to-face conversations, there's insights gained that you lose, whether it's on the phone, and even from the phone to text. There's things that you don't pick up. There's nuances, there's tone, there's other aspects that are conveyed in person, even like disinterest is conveyed in person that is not there in text. So, but even if we're just talking about the verbal side of communication and the verbal side of talking, well, those aren't the same. See, I could talk by myself, to myself, and to no effect. Nothing changes except maybe if I've benefited from rehearsing things out loud. The problem is we often assume that if we talk at somebody that we're communicating, that they have fully heard and they have fully agreed with everything we've said because we make the absolute best arguments out there. Often though, what we end up finding out is that they haven't moved at all. I had an individual at one point in time, they came to me and they were upset about something and oh man, they just laid into me, and I think in their mind they had perceived it wrong and they were going to straighten it out, and they had the tightest, most convincing arguments. What ended up being kind of funny about that was that as they went on in the conversation, I thought at first they wanted a conversation, so I started saying something back. And then when they hit back hard, I was like, oh, okay, they don't want to have a conversation, they want to talk. And so I just listened and let them, and at the end of the time, I just thanked them and hung up. Later they came back and they said, well, were you convinced by it? I was like, not at all. In fact, I left more convinced of my original position than when I started. But they didn't know that at all because in their mind, they were right and they had a conversation. Now, I'm not faulting them, I'm not picking on them. It's a recent example that comes to mind, and we all do it. What conversation requires is that I communicate, or I speak, or write maybe, and then the other person is there to receive, to try to interpret, and then they send back a message. And maybe it's a clarification message, maybe it adds on, maybe it's a contradiction. They send back. Then I have to listen, and then I have to understand, and then I have to take what I understand, and then process that back to them. And as a result, we create a communication loop. Talking is kind of like throwing a rock into a pond. Communicating is kind of like throwing a football. You're tossing it back and forth to each other. You're catching, you're receiving. Sometimes it gets dropped, but you pick it back up and you throw it again. And so I want us to be careful to not confuse the two. Sometimes when we fired off that great email, or we've sent that great text message, or we just let them know what we think we're communicating, but really, we're just talking. So my question is, are you talking or are you communicating?